Greetings, I'm MTG Specs and welcome to House of WUBRG, a Commander deck building series where we explore the possibilities of incorporating all 5 colours of Magic in our decks whilst finding a happy middle ground between the format staples, the good stuff if you will, and the path less travelled. And our first visitor to the House of WUBRG is the most cheerful and enigmatic character in all of Middle Earth, Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is a WUBRG commander. He is a legendary creature god bard, and the first part of his card says, as long as there are 4 or more lore counters among sagas you control, Tom Bombadil has hexproof and indestructible. The final chapter ability of a saga you control resolves. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a saga card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this jolly fellow makes it immediately clear he wants us to fill our deck with sagas, an enchantment subtype that we first encountered in Dominaria back in 2018. Here's a quick recap about this card type, but if you don't need this, feel free to skip ahead to the next section all about removing lore counters. Sagas are a type of enchantment that utilise lore counters to activate a new effect each turn. As soon as a saga appears on the battlefield, you add its first lore counter and trigger its first chapter ability, which is the first ability listed on the card. Following this, after your draw step every turn and not during upkeep as commonly thought, you add another counter and execute the next chapter ability. You repeat this process, adding a lore counter each turn until you complete all the chapters. And once the final effect is achieved, the saga is sacrificed. Now, if you thought sagas were one and done storybooks, think again, because we have other cards in our deck that can remove lore counters from the sagas, and that means we can continue to trigger chapters again and again and again. With Power Conduit, we can remove a counter from any permanent we control, and we can turn it into a charge counter for a target artifact, or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, which will work wonderfully on Tom Bombadil when we get to our win cons. Chisay, Heart of the Oceans, has an upkeep cost where you sacrifice Chisay unless you remove a counter from a permanent you control. Scholar of New Horizons is doing double duty as a ramp card and a card that can remove counters from sagas. It says Scholar of New Horizons enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can tap it to remove a counter from a permanent you control. Search your library for a plains card and reveal it, and if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may put that card onto the battlefield tapped. You don't put that card onto the battlefield, you put it into your hand, and then you shuffle. A new card from Phyrexia, All Will Be One, Glyssa Sunslayer. If she makes contact with an opponent, you can remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. Or we can bounce our sagas. Brago, when it makes contact, you can exile any number of our sagas and then return them to the battlefield under our control. Displace a kitten. Every time we cast a non-land permanent, we can exile a card and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and our sagas are non-land permanents, so we are able to do that frequently throughout the match. Yorion Sky Nomad, when it comes into play, exile any number of other non-land permanents which will return at the beginning of the next end step. Let's exile our sagas, return them, and get some more incremental value from their first chapter ability. And a quick rules note about sagas: taking off a counter does not trigger the chapter before, only putting on a counter will trigger a chapter. There just isn't enough room to show you all of the different sagas that have some kind of removal attached. Here are some highlights. Elspeth's Nightmare has 3 different types of removal attached to it. Firstly, destroying a target creature an opponent controls with power 2 or less. Secondly, ripping a non-creature card out of your opponent's hand and then exiling their graveyard. Time of Ice taps down creatures opponents control that don't untap for as long as you control Time of Ice, and in this deck, that can be for quite a long time. We also return all tapped creatures to their owner's hands, so that's deterring our opponents from attacking you. They tap out to attack. Next turn, all those cards are going to go back to their hands. The Chrome War is gaining control of a target creature for as long as the Chrome War remains on the battlefield on its first chapter. Again, with the rules of sagas, we are going to be able to keep the Chrome War on the battlefield for longer than the 3 chapters that it presents. Binding the Old Gods and All-Star in our saga deck. Chapter 1, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Phyrexian Scriptures. That second chapter is destroying all non-artifact creatures, and in the first chapter, we're able to protect one of our creatures from that board wipe by turning it into an artifact. Elspeth's Conquer's Death can exile target permanent an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater, and then it provides a taxing effect to non-creature spells in its second chapter. Inventive Iteration, in its first chapter, can return up to one target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand, but it's the backside of that card that's the all-star Living Breakthrough. Whenever you cast a spell, your opponents can't cast spells with the same mana value as that spell until your next turn. And finally, destroy target land on a saga on Waking the Trolls. Proliferate may sound like a tempting option. Being able to put counters onto our sagas allows us to trigger the chapter abilities more than once each turn, but with Tom Bombadil, we want a less is more approach. Because if we can keep 4 lore counters on the sagas we control, Tom will have hexproof and indestructible. He is a win con in the command zone. Plus, with the power of enchantments on our side, we can legitimately win with a Voltron strategy. And to illustrate this point, I'd like to talk about another commander that I use that isn't a 5-colour commander. He's a Gruul commander, Stang Echo Warrior. He creates his own twin when he attacks, and then creates a copy of any enchantment or artifact that's attached to him, attached to Stang Twin as well. My win con in that deck, Nylea's Colossus. Nylea's Colossus says, whenever Nylea's Colossus or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, double target creature's power and toughness until end of turn. So with Tom Bombadil out, he's a 4/4, maybe a 5/5 if Phyrexian Scriptures has popped a +1/+1 counter onto him. How many enchantments do we need to make him a lethal blow? So one enchantment comes in, he becomes an 8/8, then another 16/16, and finally a 32/32. That is a one-hit kill with commander damage through the use of Nylea's Colossus. Add in a Whitewater Naiads, and we get unblockable creatures, an unblockable Tom Bombadil, every time an enchantment enters the battlefield. If you don't want to utilise Tom from the command zone, you could always go wide instead. Historian's Boon says that whenever another non-token enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, but it's that second part of the card which is super impactful, saying that whenever the final chapter ability of a saga you control triggers, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. Don't forget, we can remove the lore counter, so the next turn the final chapter will trigger again, creating another 4/4 white angel creature token. Shark Typhoon says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is the spell's converted mana cost. Archon of Sun's Grace, triggering every time an enchantment enters the battlefield, will give you a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying, and other Pegasus creatures have lifelink whilst Archon of Sun's Grace is on the battlefield. Or maybe you might like Ajani's Chosen and build yourself an army of 2/2 white cats. Alongside Dance of the Manse and Starfield of Nyx, we also have options like Opalescence, which says for 2 and 2 white, each other global enchantment is a creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost, and they remain as enchantments. Or maybe you'd like to animate those enchantments with Zur Eternal Schema for 1 and a white. Non-aura enchantment you control will become a creature in addition to its other types with base power and toughness equal to its mana value, and Zur gives those enchantment creatures Death Touch, lifelink, and hexproof. We have an incredible range of cards for recursion. Cosmic Intervention is a Foretell 2 instant, and it says if a permanent you control will be put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, exile it instead. We're going to return those permanents under our control at the beginning of our next end step. Again, Arcane and Weaver for red, white, and black, and for those same colours, you can tap him to sacrifice an enchantment, return a target enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield. Resurgent Belief is a suspend 2 version of Replenish, Replenish being a card from the reserve list. Very expensive. Eerie Ultimatum with 2 white, 3 black, and 2 green. Return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield. We're in a format that's based around singleton cards with different names. Starfield of Nyx. Oh my word, an incredible card. It's a win con, it's recursion. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may return target enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That's every single upkeep. And as long as you control 5 or more enchantments, each other non-aura enchantment you control is a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and toughness equal to its converted mana cost. And Dance of the Manse, another card which is recursion and a win con. We return up to X target artifact and or non-aura enchantment cards, each with mana value X or less, from our graveyard to the battlefield. If X is 6 or more, those permanents are 4/4 creatures in addition to their other types. As our commander doesn't have any colourless mana in his casting cost, and we want to eke out every single enchantment trigger, we don't need artifacts cluttering up our deck synergies. When you've got a 5-colour deck, green is just so good at smoothing out our mana and finding us the land cards that we need. So we are including Kodama's Reach, Free Visits, and a Utopian Sprawl, which is an enchantment allowing us to trigger off all of our enchantment synergies. And with that in mind, we're including Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and he allows us to play an additional land on each turn, is an enchantment creature, so he's triggering those enchantment synergies, and our lands are going to be every basic type. An absolute boon in a 5-colour deck. Sanctum Weaver is an enchantment creature also for 1 and a green, and can tap to add X mana of any one colour, where X is the number of enchantments we control. Azusa's Many Journeys is a saga that comes into play for 1 and a green, and that first chapter ability allows us to play additional lands. And if you should be lucky enough to have an exploration in your collection, we can throw that in too. Feyburrow Elder is an absolute all-star in a 5-colour deck. You can tap him, and for each colour among permanents you control, add 1 mana of that colour. And we will be delving deeper into the world of 5-colour mana bases and getting the most out of your resources in a future video. So if that sounds good to you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Our draw package is centred around Showdown of the Scouts is a saga for 2, a red and a white, and it allows us on chapter 1 to exile the top 4 cards of our library, and we can play those cards until the end of our next turn. Sithis the Harvest Hand says whenever we cast enchantment we get to draw a card and gain a life. Tuvasa the Sunlit, whenever we cast our first enchantment spell each turn we get to draw a card, and is a backup win con, getting +1/+1 for each enchantment that we control. We've got the standard enchantment, Enchantress's Presence for 2 and a green. Whenever we cast an enchantment spell, draw a card, and then a card I found by looking beyond the obvious, the Femeref Enchantress, which says whenever an enchantment is put into our graveyard from play, draw a card. First up, we have Aether Snap, which is like a giant reset button for our sagas, and sometimes for our opponent's plans. It removes all the counters from our sagas and wipes out all the tokens on the battlefield. Say goodbye to those pesky token creatures, treasure tokens, and the new incubator tokens, and more. Next we'll have All Be One, a card that does damage as we put counters on our sagas for incremental damage throughout the game. And finally, my favourite addition to the deck, Estrid's Invocation. It comes into play as a copy of our most impactful saga, triggers the first chapter of that saga and all our other enchantment synergies, and then has the option to exile itself during the upkeep step and do it all over again. And that's it for our first House of WUBRG deck tech. There are 2 deck lists in the description below, and if this was helpful and you enjoyed it, a subscribe would mean a lot to me, and it will let me know that I'm on the right path with this type of video. We will return to the House of WUBRG next week to book in the completed elemental Jellybean himself, Omnath, Locus of all. Until then, I've been MTG Specs, and I hope you find the sweet middle ground between the obvious and the road less travelled.